Picture this. You order dinner, and before you have even finished setting the table, it is already at your door. Not because a driver broke every traffic law getting there, but because no driver was involved at all. Somewhere above the rooftops, a small aircraft just dropped your meal into a box built specifically to catch it. This is not a demonstration for investors. It is Tuesday night in dozens of Chinese cities, and it barely makes the news anymore. That quiet normalization is the real story. Not one flashy invention, but an entire country treating machines that would be front page news anywhere else as background noise. Delivery drones, self-driving trucks, robot dogs, humanoid workers, AI-powered hospitals. A national curriculum that teaches 6-year-olds how machine learning works. None of it is science fiction. All of it is operating today, in 2026, at a scale that is difficult to grasp until you start comparing the numbers to something familiar. Part of what makes this hard to appreciate from the outside is that no single headline captures it. A story about one clever gadget is easy to dismiss as a novelty. A story about dozens of separate industries, cars, trains, hospitals, farms, classrooms, all moving in the same direction at the same time, and all backed by the same underlying push toward automation and artificial intelligence, is much harder to write off. That is really the shape of what is happening in China right now. It deserves to be walked through carefully, industry by industry, rather than reduced to a single viral clip. So let us start small, with the sky over China's cities, because that is where a lot of this began. Food delivery drones are now a routine part of daily life in parts of urban China. Companies like Meituan and SF Express have built networks of small aircraft that fly fixed routes between restaurants and drop-off points, landing packages and dedicated collection boxes, so nobody has to wait on a street corner for a rider to show up. The pitch is simple. Cut a 30-minute wait down to something closer to 15. In dense cities where delivery riders already move at a breakneck pace, shaving that time down by flying over the traffic instead of through it has turned out to be more than a gimmick. It has become infrastructure. The countryside tells a different, arguably more important version of the same story. JD.com has been flying heavier cargo drones capable of hauling loads measured in tens of kilograms into villages that traditional delivery services often skipped because the roads were too poor or too far from a distribution hub. Think of it less as a novelty and more as a flying pickup truck for places where the truck itself was never a realistic option. For rural residents who used to wait days for a package, that is a genuine change in quality of life, not just a curiosity for tech blogs. If drones handle what falls from the sky, China's roads tell an even bigger story about what happens when nobody's holding the steering wheel at all. Self-driving capability is no longer an experimental add-on in Chinese cars, it is becoming a mainstream feature. A large share of new vehicles sold in China this year come equipped with some level of automated driving assistance, and adoption is moving faster than in almost any other major auto market. Part of the reason is cultural as much as technical. Multiple surveys have found Chinese consumers considerably more comfortable trusting a computer to drive them than American consumers are. And that comfort gap shows up directly in how quickly the technology gets adopted on ordinary streets, rather than staying locked inside test facilities. Speaking of test facilities, China has moved well past them. Robotaxi pilots are now running in numerous cities, with thousands of test vehicles logging enormous combined mileage on public roads under government supervision. It is one of the largest real-world experiments in autonomous transport happening anywhere in the world right now, and the fact that it is spread across so many cities simultaneously, rather than concentrated in one showcase location, says something about how confident planners have become in the underlying technology. Behind all of this sits one company that has come to symbolize just how fast Chinese vehicle manufacturing has scaled. BYD became the first automaker in the world to roll a 10 millionth new energy vehicle off its production line back in late 2024, a milestone that took the company roughly 15 years to reach for its first 5 million units and only about 15 months to double. The pace since then has only accelerated. By late 2025, BYD had passed 15 million units, and by the summer of 2026, the company had already crossed 17 million new energy vehicles produced, adding 2 million more in just a handful of months. To put that acceleration in perspective, some of the world's oldest and largest car companies took the better part of a century to build their first 10 million vehicles of any kind. BYD did it with electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles alone in a fraction of that time, while simultaneously expanding sales into more than 100 countries. That scale of manufacturing is part of why so many of the more eye-catching vehicles coming out of China right now are not one-off concept cars sitting in a design studio. They are backed by a production system large enough to actually put them in driveways. Some of the vehicles themselves sound like they were designed by engineers who got bored with ordinary cars. BYD's Yangwang sub-brand builds an armored off-road SUV, the U8, that can rotate almost in place by spinning its wheels in opposite directions, a trick made possible because each wheel has its own independent electric motor rather than sharing power through a single drivetrain. The same vehicle is built to drive into standing water and float, using its wheels to paddle itself along, a feature that sounds like overkill. Until you remember how often flooding strands ordinary cars in Chinese cities during monsoon season. Then there is the U9, and specifically its track-focused extreme variant, which is where BYD's ambitions stopped being about clever party tricks and became about raw numbers. In September of 2025, on a test track in Germany, the U9 Extreme reached a top speed of 496, 22 kilometers per hour, a figure that put it ahead of the previous fastest production car on record, a Bugatti that maxed out just under 491 kilometers per hour. Because the run was measured in only one direction rather than the two directions record bodies typically require. Some official record lists have not certified it as the outright record holder. Even so, it stands as one of the fastest production cars ever built, electric or otherwise, and it did it using 4 independently controlled motors instead of a combustion engine. The same car can reportedly go from a standstill to 100 kilometers per hour in a little over 2.3 seconds. And its suspension system is engineered to lift all 4 wheels briefly off the ground in a synchronized motion, essentially letting a $200,000 hypercar bounce on command. None of that matters much if the batteries take an hour to refill. That has been the traditional weak point of electric vehicles compared to a 5-minute gas station stop. And Chinese manufacturers have been racing to eliminate that disadvantage entirely. BYD has introduced ultra-fast charging systems built around a megawatt-class charging architecture, aiming to deliver hundreds of kilometers of range in the time it takes to grab a coffee. The broader trend across Chinese EV makers is unmistakable. Charging speed is becoming less of a compromise and, in some cases, faster than filling a traditional fuel tank. While cars are getting faster, China has also been pushing trains towards speeds that used to belong exclusively to airplanes. The country has developed and tested magnetic levitation trains, vehicles that float above their tracks using magnetic force rather than rolling on wheels, eliminating the friction that limits how fast a conventional train can go. Test runs of Chinese maglev prototypes have reached speeds in excess of 600 kilometers per hour, comparable to a commercial jet's cruising speed, though still well below actual takeoff or cruising altitude speeds of an aircraft. A commercially deployed, high-speed maglev line connecting major cities would, in principle, cut a 5.5-hour train journey down to roughly 2.5 hours. That is not a future promise. The core technology already exists and has been demonstrated repeatedly on test tracks. To put the physics in plain terms, a maglev train never actually touches its guideway while running. Instead of wheels grinding against steel rails, magnets built into the train and the track repel and attract each other in a way that lifts the entire vehicle a few centimeters into the air and pushes it forward with almost none of the friction that limits a conventional train's top speed. It is the same basic principle that lets a magnet hover above another magnet on a desk, just engineered at a scale that can carry hundreds of passengers. China already operates a commercial maglev line connecting Shanghai to its airport, running at lower everyday speeds, which means the country is not simply testing the concept in a lab. It has been running paying passengers on magnetic levitation for years. The newer, faster prototypes represent the next generation of that same underlying technology, not a completely untested idea. All of this hardware needs people who understand it, which is why China's most consequential investment might not be sitting on a road or in the sky at all. It is sitting in a classroom. Starting in the fall of 2025, Beijing became the first major region in China to make artificial intelligence education compulsory for every student, from 6-year-olds in primary school up through seniors in high school. The policy requires a minimum of 8 hours of dedicated AI instruction per academic year across more than 1,400 schools in the city, with lessons scaled to age. Younger children get hands-on, experiential activities designed to build curiosity. Middle schoolers explore how AI shows up in daily life and problem solving, and high schoolers move into more advanced applications and ethical questions around the technology. The program is not limited to Beijing. Similar mandates and pilot programs are spreading to other provinces, part of a broader national strategy to build an AI-literate workforce a decade ahead of when today's students would normally enter the job market. Whatever you think of the approach, the scale is remarkable. An entire generation is being raised treating artificial intelligence the way earlier generations were raised treating basic arithmetic. That kind of long-term thinking about infrastructure shows up again in one of the least glamorous but most telling examples of Chinese automation. Building the roads those self-driving cars actually drive on. Mining and construction companies in China have been experimenting with entirely autonomous heavy equipment fleets, including massive haul trucks capable of carrying tens of tons of material without a human driver, operating in conditions including extreme cold that would challenge human operators working long shifts. Alongside them, autonomous road rollers and pavers have been deployed to handle the compacting and surfacing work using GPS guidance and coordinated automation. effectively building sections of road with minimal direct human labor on site. The stated ambition from companies operating in this space is to scale these autonomous truck fleets into the thousands over the next several years. Whether that exact timeline holds, the direction is clear. Heavy industrial labor that used to require large human crews is being handed to coordinated fleets of machines. It is worth sitting with why this particular application makes sense before almost any other. Mining sites and highway construction zones are, in a strange way, easier environments for autonomous vehicles to operate in than a crowded city street. The routes are repetitive, the terrain is controlled by the company operating the site rather than shared with pedestrians and cyclists, and the consequences of overly cautious driving are minor compared to the consequences of a mistake in city traffic. That combination, high-value repetitive labor in a controlled environment, is exactly the kind of problem autonomous systems are best suited to solve today, well before they are ready to handle the genuine unpredictability of a school zone at pickup time. It is a useful reminder that the places automation shows up first are not necessarily the most glamorous ones, but they are often the ones that make the most practical sense. If you want to see automation applied to something everybody experiences directly, though, skip the mining site and go to the airport. Major Chinese airports have invested heavily in biometric processing, using facial recognition to move passengers through check-in, baggage drop, security, and boarding with minimal human interaction. Shanghai's Hongqiao Airport has been highlighted as a facility where the entire process, from arrival to boarding, can happen through automated, camera-driven checkpoints rather than staffed counters at every step. Beijing's largest airport operates hundreds of biometric checkpoints and automated gates. The overall effect for a traveler willing to use the system is a trip through the airport that feels less like standing in lines and more like walking through a series of automatic doors that happen to know exactly who you are. For anyone who has spent a holiday morning stuck behind a slow-moving security line elsewhere in the world, the appeal is obvious, even before you get into the deeper questions of what a biometric database that detailed is being used for once you are through the gate. That last detail, cameras that already know who you are, scales up dramatically once you leave the airport. China has installed an enormous nationwide surveillance camera network, with estimates putting the total number of cameras in the hundreds of millions, a network sometimes referred to informally as Skynet, using facial recognition to identify individuals in public spaces at scale. The system has been used for tasks ranging from identifying jaywalkers to broader public security monitoring, and it represents one of the most extensive camera-based identification networks operating anywhere in the world. It is worth being careful here about separating documented capability from speculative claims. What is well established is mass-scale facial recognition monitoring of public spaces. Claims that go further, suggesting the system can reliably forecast individual criminal behavior before it happens, are not something that can currently be verified, and should be treated with real skepticism rather than repeated as settled fact. It is genuinely difficult to find another country running biometric identification at this density, which is exactly why the topic deserves a level-headed treatment rather than either breathless alarm or casual dismissal. A surveillance network of this scale changes the relationship between individuals and public space in ways that are still being debated inside China itself, let alone outside it, and reasonable people looking at the same set of facts can and do reach very different conclusions about whether the security benefits justify the trade-offs involved. Surveillance is not the only place cameras and sensors have quietly replaced older habits. Payment itself has been changing shape too. Mobile payment through QR codes and phone apps has been standard in China for years, but the newest step skips the phone entirely. Palm-based payment systems, including a WeChat rollout of palm scanning technology, let users pay by holding out their hand to a scanner that reads the unique pattern of veins beneath the skin, a method that proponents argue is both more secure than a fingerprint and faster than pulling out a wallet or phone. It has been adopted in a growing number of retail locations, on some university campuses, and in select transit settings, with reported error rates that are extremely low for a biometric system operating at that kind of volume. Whether it becomes the dominant payment method or remains a niche convenience is still an open question, but the technology itself is real, tested at scale, and already part of daily transactions for a meaningful number of people. It is a small, almost mundane example, but it captures the broader pattern well. China rarely stops at the first version of a convenience. If a phone can replace a wallet, the next question asked is whether a hand can replace the phone. From payments, it is a short conceptual leap to robots doing physical work alongside people. And this is where China has arguably made its most visible progress of the last 2 years. Unitree, a Hangzhou-based robotics company, has become one of the most closely watched names in humanoid robotics, largely because of price. Its G1 model stands roughly 1.33 meters tall, weighs around 35 kilograms, and starts at a price near $16,000, a fraction of what comparable humanoid platforms from other companies have historically cost. It packs more than 20 degrees of freedom in its joints, expandable to over 40 in higher-end configurations, letting it walk, run, sit, wave, and manipulate objects with a level of natural motion that looked impossible in humanoid robots just a few years ago. It can fold down to a compact size for transport, similar to packing a large suitcase, and it has already been demonstrated performing tasks ranging from basic manipulation to, in some showcase videos, coordinated dance routines and acrobatics. Unitree has reportedly shipped several thousand units and is scaling production toward tens of thousands annually, numbers that would have sounded absurd for a humanoid robot company just 5 years ago. The company has also built 4-legged robot dogs capable of running at speeds well above a brisk human jog, climbing over obstacles, performing flips, and responding to voice commands, with some models deployed in demonstrations at major sporting events and reportedly tested by security and public safety organizations in several countries. It is worth being honest about the limits here, too. These robots are impressive research and demonstration platforms, genuinely capable of real tasks, but they are not yet fully autonomous household staff. Battery life is typically measured in a couple of hours, and many of the most polished demonstrations, like synchronized dancing, are choreographed rather than examples of the robot improvising in an unfamiliar situation. The honest version of this story is still remarkable. It just is not the version where a robot butler is already living in ordinary homes. What makes Unitree's pricing especially significant is what it does to the rest of the industry. For years, a functional humanoid robot from a Western lab or company cost somewhere in the range of a small house, which kept the technology confined almost entirely to research institutions and a handful of well-funded corporations. A price tag closer to that of a used car changes who gets to experiment with the technology. University labs, small startups, and even hobbyists can now buy a working humanoid platform instead of only reading about one in a research paper. That shift, more than any single dance routine or backflip demonstration, is likely to be the more consequential legacy of this current wave of Chinese humanoid robotics, because it is the difference between a technology that stays locked inside a handful of elite labs and one that spreads widely enough for thousands of independent developers to start finding uses for it that nobody has thought of yet. Somewhat more unsettling, at least to first-time viewers, are humanoid robots built specifically to look and move like real people rather than like machines. Chinese companies working in this space have built androids with lifelike synthetic skin, dozens of independently controlled facial movements and functional conversational ability, some priced in the hundreds of thousands of dollars given the manufacturing complexity involved. A few of these robots have been built as representations of historical figures for museum and educational exhibits, giving visitors an interactive, conversational stand-in for a historical scientist or public figure. These machines are currently deployed mostly in controlled settings such as museums, hotels, and government service counters, rather than in everyday public life. But the underlying trajectory, robots that are increasingly difficult to distinguish from people at a glance, is one worth paying attention to as the technology matures and the price eventually comes down. Robotics has also been quietly reshaping Chinese healthcare in ways that matter more directly to ordinary people than any dancing supercar or humanoid mascot. Automated systems for tasks like drawing blood with robotic precision have been piloted in Chinese hospitals aimed at reducing the discomfort and repeated attempts that come with manual blood draws. Hospital logistics robots now handle a meaningful share of medication delivery in some facilities, moving prescriptions from pharmacy to ward automatically and reducing the delays that come from relying entirely on staff during busy shifts. Remote surgery, where a surgeon operates a robotic system from a different city than the patient, has been demonstrated in China across genuinely long distances, extending specialist surgical expertise to patients in regions that would otherwise have no local access to that level of care. Separately, AI-powered diagnostic and conversational systems have been piloted in some Chinese healthcare settings to support triage and basic patient interaction, generally as an assistive layer working alongside human clinicians rather than as a wholesale replacement for doctors. Specific performance claims about robotic diagnostic accuracy vary a great deal depending on the study and the condition involved, so it is worth treating any single headline statistic about robot doctors outperforming humans with caution rather than as a universal fact. There's a common thread running through all of these healthcare examples that is easy to miss if you only focus on the technology itself: geography. China is an enormous country with a deeply uneven distribution of medical specialists, heavily concentrated in major coastal cities, while rural and inland regions often go without easy access to advanced surgical care. Remote robotic surgery and automated diagnostic support are not just impressive engineering demonstrations in that context. They are one of the more realistic ways to extend a small pool of highly trained specialists across a country of well over 1 billion people without physically relocating those specialists themselves. That framing matters, because it shifts the story away from robots replacing doctors for the sake of novelty and toward robots extending expertise into places that would otherwise simply go without it. Agriculture, often the least discussed part of any country's technology story, has gone through a similarly quiet transformation. Chinese agricultural drone manufacturers, DJI among the most prominent, produce heavy lift drones capable of carrying substantial loads of seed or pesticide, spraying fields with a precision and speed that would take a large human crew far longer to match, and increasingly capable of operating with minimal direct supervision using onboard obstacle sensing. Specialized robotic systems have also been developed for labor-intensive crop tasks, such as trimming cotton plants across large fields far faster than manual labor could manage. And automated transplanting machinery can plant seedlings across several hectares of farmland in a single day, a task that previously required dozens of workers. The practical effect in rural China has been a steady reduction in how many people are needed to farm the same amount of land, freeing up labor for other work while helping address a shrinking rural workforce as younger generations move to cities. Step back from any single one of these examples, and a pattern becomes obvious. This was never really a story about flying pizza or a supercar that can dance. It is a story about a country that decided, roughly a decade ago, to treat automation and artificial intelligence as core national infrastructure rather than a side project for a few tech companies, and then followed through on that decision across transportation, construction, healthcare, agriculture, payments, and education all at the same time. Individually, drone delivery in one country and fast-charging batteries in another and humanoid robots in a third would each be a solid headline. Having all of them develop simultaneously, reinforcing each other, inside a single national strategy is what makes the Chinese version of this story different from similar experiments happening piecemeal elsewhere. None of it is flawless. Surveillance infrastructure built at this scale raises real and unresolved questions about privacy and civil liberties that deserve honest scrutiny rather than either uncritical celebration or reflexive dismissal. Humanoid robots remain expensive, battery limited, and often more polished in a demo than in daily use. Self-driving systems still operate under heavy regulatory supervision precisely because they are not yet flawless in unpredictable everyday conditions. The technology is real. The rollout is genuinely large scale. But real and large scale is not the same as finished or without trade-offs, and the most useful way to understand what is happening in China right now is to hold both of those truths at once, the scale of the achievement and the legitimate questions it raises, rather than picking only one. There's also a competitive dimension to all of this that is impossible to ignore. Every one of these industries, electric vehicles, robotics, autonomous driving, drone logistics, is being pursued by companies and governments outside China too, often with serious funding and genuine technical talent behind them. What distinguishes the Chinese approach so far has been coordination, a national strategy that treats AI education, manufacturing capacity, autonomous vehicle testing, and robotics deployment as pieces of one connected system tends to produce faster real-world rollout than the same technologies developing in isolated pockets, scattered across different countries and companies with different incentives. That is not a guarantee of permanent advantage. Technology leadership has shifted before, sometimes quickly, and other countries are actively working to close the gap in areas like battery chemistry, chip design, and robotics software. But it does help explain why so much of this feels like it arrived all at once, rather than trickling out one product launch at a time, the way technology adoption often does elsewhere. What seems hardest to dispute is the direction of travel. A generation of Chinese children is growing up learning to build and question artificial intelligence the way earlier generations learned long division. The machines around them, in the sky, on the roads, in hospitals, and increasingly standing on two legs beside them are not demonstrations anymore. They are simply how things get done. The question worth sitting with is not whether this technology will eventually show up everywhere else too. The real question is what a society looks like once the machines stop being the interesting part of the story and just become the ordinary backdrop of daily life, the way delivery drones already have in the cities where this all began.